Let us begin the session. And actually, David, have you attended these sessions before as well?
No, eventually it's my first time.
Okay, if it's your first time, in that case, I'll give you an introduction to our company and what it is that we do. So this webinar is brought to you by English Book Education, the company I work for. And English Book Education is divided up into 8 pillars. And among these 8 pillars, it includes teachers' professional development, unique learning, which is our language school in Varkey. We also offer qualifications for people who need them, like TEFL courses, and there's also book club, Kings and Queens Club, to be precise, which is, and I'm the Kings and Queens Club's native speaker. And what we do, one of the things we do with Kings and Queens Club is we run a book club, a national book club, and we travel around the country doing these sessions with students. And the aim of these sessions is to basically give them a love of reading. And we meet up once a month, and each month we'll discuss a title, we'll discuss the themes in the title, the author, the historical context, and we also ask these students to do presentations, which works on their communication skills, etc., which we consider to be an invaluable skill. We also give out the books for free, and I believe we've given free books out to over 40 schools. So anyway, today's webinar is about Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And I'm just curious if any of you have actually heard of Jordan Peterson before, if you know anything about him, who he is.
Oh, I have just once seen my friend's house, and actually I'm wondering to buy it, but not.
Okay, but you don't know about Jordan.
Yes, I have heard about it. So.
Okay, cool, interesting. What I'm thinking for this session, I think the most effective way of doing this is, because there aren't that many of you, you guys can speak, but when you're not speaking, let's turn our microphones off. When you do speak, turn it on, obviously. So that's probably the best way to go about this. Okay, so I've got to say this from the outset, that I'm a really big fan of Jordan Peterson. So I'm going to try my best not to be biased when I'm talking about him. I'm a bit of a fan, but I'm going to try and present him as neutrally as possible, because this is an author that has really divided opinion, polarized opinion. Some people really hate him and some people really like him. So I'll try and offer up both perspectives over this really interesting individual. So we'll talk about the author. Oh dear, this is the, yes. So today we'll talk about the author, and then we'll talk about some of the books he's written. So Jordan Peterson was born on the 12th of June in 1962, grew up in Fairview, Alberta, Canada. Now this is in northern Canada, and this is a really, really cold part of Canada. So life was pretty, let's just say, cold growing up. And I believe there wasn't much sunlight either. His professional career, he's done many things, including being an advisor to the UN, but his main career has always been a professor of psychology, and he studied psychology at the University of Toronto, and then went on to get a doctorate in psychology and became a clinical psychologist. So he's got his own patients, etc. I'm not sure if he still is, but up until very recently, he was a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And this is him maybe 20 years ago with his daughter. Now, it's important to understand him as a character because it will really explain his motivations for writing this book. He's actually got depression, and he believes he's inherited it from his father genetically, and he says it's a long-running problem that goes throughout the family. And perhaps one of his motivations for going into psychology was to understand his depression and his illness. His life was also full of tragedy. His daughter grew up with this very life-threatening illness where essentially all her bones became very weak, and she broke her bones incredibly easily. So growing up, his daughter spent her whole life in hospital, and obviously that would have put a huge strain on the family. But the other thing is he grew up in the 60s and early 70s, and this is sort of a time when the world was very aware of the capabilities of nuclear weapons and the potential for nuclear annihilation. And Peterson has often said in some of his lectures and some of his YouTube podcasts, he says that one of the things that really motivated me to go into psychology and to go into literature is he wanted to understand the human psychology and what could bring man to the brink of destruction. He wanted to understand how on earth we were capable of such things. And likewise, growing up 20 years after the Second World War, with the tragedies of the Second World War still quite fresh in the mind of society, he also became very motivated to study the political doctrines of Marxism and fascism and the history of Marxism and fascism in a lot of detail. And again, he saw all the suffering, and it really just made him question, why on earth do humans do these things? But more importantly, how can we avoid doing these things? What is the answer to all this nihilism, to all this destruction, to all this suffering? And this is the sort of key thing that he explores in most of his work. And from all of this, something that's also very common in his work is this idea that life is suffering. And he truly believes that the meaning of life is suffering. And all of his works try and figure out a way of dealing with the suffering. What is the appropriate way to deal with the suffering of life? Okay. Do you guys agree with that? Do you think life is suffering? Fundamentally, first and foremost, when you look at the world, you look at the ills of the Second World War, the potential for nuclear annihilation, starvation, would you say the fundamental characteristic of life is suffering, as he believes it is? And perhaps if you want to put your answers in the group chat. If you guys have any questions at any point, please just put it in the group chat and I will keep my eye on the group chat. Okay? All right. So this motivated him to write his first book. And he spent, I believe, 10 years writing this book. It's called Maps of Meaning. And what Maps of Meaning, as the title suggests, means is how do you map meaning into a life that seems to be meaningless? How do we create these routes? How do we traverse the terrain of life? Okay, and one thing he believes that the thing that can give us meaning in our lives are these old stories and myths. Jordan Peterson is considered a protege of Carl Jung, and Carl Jung had a very significant influence on Jordan Peterson's psychological methods and his understanding of the human psyche. So in order to understand Peterson, perhaps we need to talk a little bit about Carl Jung. And some of Carl Jung's key ideas. Now, Carl Jung believed that this was the structure of the human mind. There's the conscious mind, there's the unconscious mind, but then there's also the collective unconscious, okay? And it's a slightly different model for the psyche compared to the likes of Freud, for example. And what this collective unconscious refers to is the part of psychology that all human beings share in common. So we all are somehow connected to one another with the ideas that we have. And these are ideas that we are born with and have been passed on throughout evolution. And the key ideas that he talks about are things called archetypes. Jung talks about archetypes, that within the collective unconscious, we all have this sense of archetypes, and we identify archetypes in stories and in everyday life all the time because we've already got this innate understanding of archetypes. Can someone think of an example of an archetype then? Can someone describe perhaps in more detail what is an archetype, or can you think of an example of an archetype? And perhaps to explain an archetype better, an archetype is a consistently reoccurring pattern, whether it be in stories or in reality. Can you think of some archetypes? A constantly reoccurring pattern that happens all throughout history and that people can identify. Do any of you have any idea of an example of an archetype? What do we think? And please perhaps put your answers in the group chat. Okay. Maybe I'll give you an example and that will help. So an example of an archetype is, for example, the hero archetype. Okay, so what hero, the character of the hero is common in almost every single story, and the hero has a very well-defined narrative and character arc. Now, the reason we write about heroes is not because, well, according to Jung, is not because we made up the character of the hero, but because the hero is a very real concept that exists in the human imagination. In fact, it's part of our reality, this understanding of what the hero is. Likewise, we have there's an archetype of the trickster character, and we can identify this trickster character in multiple different people. People can embody these archetypes. So, for example, an example of a trickster character could be so what a trickster does. A trickster uses humor, comedy, and deception to basically access truth. So if you guys know, in medieval times, a king would have a jester or a trickster, and this jester had the ability that no one else had, and that was he could make jokes about the king. Okay, he was the only one who had the license to do so, and the king let him do it. And these jokes sort of created a way for the trickster to be able to speak out truth. And quite often there are some very significant trickster characters in history who have been catalysts for political change and change in general. And some people refer perhaps to Donald Trump as a trickster, partly because he's so unpredictable. He speaks the truth to some extent, but he does so using deceit and comedy. So people can embody these archetypes, at least according to Jung. And likewise, a hero is an example of an archetype. So having said that, having given those examples, can you think of any other type of archetypes that exist? Okay. Anyway, so these archetypes are present in old stories and myths. And Peterson says that we need to use these old stories and myths and the wisdom which are present in these old stories and myths, and we need to bring them to the present. Because there's certain stories that we've forgotten about, and we've forgotten the really deep meaning behind these stories. And these stories can give us meaning and can show us a way how to live our lives. And the typical example that Peterson uses as an archetypal story is the story of Jesus Christ. And essentially the idea that our entire society and nation is based upon the biblical narrative. So, for example, when Christ is carrying the cross and he's dragging it along, but he does so willingly, the message there is to bear your suffering. Life is suffering, and you should bear it. You should accept it like Jesus does. That's just one story among many that comes out of the narrative of Christ. Other things he points to is, for example, Christianity gives us this notion that all men are created equal in the eyes of God, and all men are worthy of love, men and women, excuse me. And that's fundamentally what the structure of our political system is. We all have equal rights. We all are valued. And he suggests that idea comes from Christianity. And that's because the Christian story, because it is a story fundamentally, is what underlies our culture. It is the fundamental basis of our culture. Another thing he identifies is that other religions can also contain some very deep symbolic truths. And for example, there's the Taoist symbol, the yin-yang principle. And the yin-yang principle, it's essentially two snakes devouring each other. And the yin-yang principle is representative of order and chaos. And he says that these are the two fundamental elements of life. And this is how you should view life. Everything has an element of order and chaos in it. And so what do I mean by order and chaos? Perhaps an example of order and chaos is perhaps the difference between political ideologies. So one political ideology can encompass chaos more, and the other can encompass order more. So for example, a more conservative political ideology is more on the side of order. Why? Because conservative ideology tries to put structure and barriers on things. It puts borders around things, and it tries to categorize and define things. So like more conservative countries, for example, they have more well-defined borders, and they have less immigration. They're more nationalistic. They're more about defining what their nationality means. Liberal ideology is more on the side of chaos, in the sense that they don't believe in this notion as much of the nation. They don't like the idea of putting borders around things. Liberal ideology, as well as something like liberal art, it doesn't like to say things like "that is beautiful art." See you tomorrow, Misha. Yeah. All right. Liberal ideology, and for example, liberal art, it doesn't like to put borders and shapes on things. It'll say everything is subjective, and that there is no such thing as beautiful art. It's all in the eye of the beholder. Okay? Can we see how liberal is more chaotic and conservative is more orderly? And by the way, when I say these things, I don't want you to think that chaos is a negative thing and order is a positive thing. They're both necessary. And that's exactly what the tower symbol is encompassing, is that you need both spontaneity and you need as to be static, and they need to be in balance with one another. Things should change, certain things should change, and certain things should be kept the same. Order and chaos. And he says that honestly, these two forces are, they exist in everything. Yeah. In fact, even the Bible has this reference to God. God created out of nothing. God created out of chaos. And this is often what's depicted in many creation stories, this idea of order, logic, meaning coming into being in a sea of chaos. So, for example, God speaks the world into existence. God spoke the word, and the word was good. And Jesus is the word fundamentally, who creates order among chaos. Okay, I don't want to overdo this point, but do you understand it? Do you understand symbolically the idea of order and chaos? Yeah. Okay. Now, the nice thing about this book is, like we said, it's always important to understand something about the author, to understand their motivations, to know their biography. Because Peterson came to fame quite recently, he's quite a recent phenomenon, he's become really famous. That means that he's very well documented, as in there's lots of videos of him speaking. He has a huge presence on YouTube. He has over a million subscribers. He's known all over the world. So we can get to know this author really well through podcasts, YouTube videos, which I recommend all of you watch because they're really interesting, even if you disagree with him. So, and also 12 Rules for Life would never have been published had he not come to such popularity. And he didn't come to popularity necessarily for his ideas in psychology. It actually revolved more around certain controversies that happened. I believe it started in the year of 2013, where Canada was going to introduce some new hate speech laws. Now, a hate speech law, do we know what hate speech laws are? Do we know what hate speech is? These are quite Western European issues. No, okay, so hate speech, hate speech essentially, as is defined by the law, is language that causes violence. And language that, if you use it, is punishable by the law. Not all countries have hate speech laws, but essentially there are certain things that you're not allowed to say, and if you say them, you could face prosecution or going to jail. For example, racist language is considered hate speech. Now it is clear. For example, racist language is considered hate speech, but no problem. But there's a debate going on whether or not it should be prosecutable or not. People who sort of fight for free speech and what are called free speech absolutists say that no language should be prosecutable by a court, that you should be able to say whatever you want and the law does not have a right to punish you for it. But then there are others who say that actually some language should be punishable by the law. What do you guys think? Do you think you should be able to say whatever you want, or should there be certain rules surrounding your speech? And then I'll tell you what Peterson thinks. Do you have an opinion on free speech? Do you think you should be able to say whatever you want? It's all about democracy. It's all about democracy. What do you mean, Dato? If you want, you can turn on your, David, excuse me. Perhaps you can turn on your microphone and explain what you mean, if you would like to. Yeah.
Yes, with great pleasure, but my Windows is a little bit old, and that's why I'm trying to write more rather than speak. I think that the free speech, of course, it's our we always need to clarify and deliver to address our speech. And yes, I think I will agree with the view that we should speak whatever we want, and
Okay, good. So you're more on the side of free speech absolutism.
Yeah.
You don't think speech should be controlled. Okay. Do we have any different opinions? George Katie, I think you should speak whatever you want. Okay. Okay. So one thing that free speech absolutists say is that it's obviously bad when someone says something racist. They see, for example, someone who has African heritage is ethnically African, and they call them you whatever, and they say a racist term. That's clearly bad. But the way you should punish those people, or at least change those people, is not by putting them in prison. Because putting them in prison might not necessarily change their ideas, because ideas are a lot more difficult to change than behavior. The suggestion is actually using your own free speech. You should have a dialogue with that person, and using your free speech, you should be able to change their mind. And this is what Peterson says about free speech. Free speech is the mechanism, a very important mechanism in society, by which we bring about change. If we don't have the ability to criticize things and say things that might challenge the entire status quo, how will we ever change? And in a sense, free speech is kind of like the chaos principle, because it can be very progressive. So an example, for example, a good example is like living in a society where there's slavery, right? Imagine if there was a law that prohibited people from criticizing slavery. You would have seen, so even if you say something that the entire society disagrees with, it might turn out that in the future, even though you're a minority, you were correct. So free speech can bring in new ideas, and it can create the possibility for change and improvement. Another thing he says is that when you're having these discussions with someone who completely disagrees with you, it's also important that you have this principle when you're having a really intense debate with someone. Always assume that the other person knows something that you don't. And if you have this approach to conversation, then there's the potential that using your shared knowledge and shared perspectives, you might create a third, new, and improved perspective. Two-sided, please. Excuse me. So yes, he's fundamentally in favor of free speech. So what caused this whole conundrum about free speech for Jordan Peterson? Well, in Canada, they wanted to introduce hate speech laws surrounding gender pronouns. And essentially, they wanted to instantiate into the law that if you misgender someone, then you could face a fine and go to prison. So, for example, you might have a biological woman who identifies as a man and wants the pronoun he. If you refuse to call them he because you disagree with the fact that they're a he, that would be considered hate speech. That would be considered hate speech, and you could face a fine and go to jail. Now, Peterson doesn't necessarily have an issue with people who are transgender. He thinks people should be able to do whatever they want. But he has an issue with the idea that the government is now regulating his speech. Because it's one thing for the law to say that there are things you shouldn't say, but it's a completely different thing for the law to force you to say things, because that would essentially be forcing you to say stuff. That would be forcing you to use pronouns that you don't believe in. Because there are certain people who just disagree with the notion of pronouns. And Peterson believes that they should have a right to disagree with the use of gender pronouns in a sort of non-typical way, where gender has been completely separated from biological sex. So this landed him in a lot of trouble, and all throughout Canada, America, he was labeled a bigot, homophobic, all these sort of things. And people really tried to shut down his speech. But it's only when, but this is what really prevails here in terms of free speech. Everyone kept trying to silence Peterson. And that was precisely why he became prominent, because it proved his point that we live in a society where speech is becoming more and more controlled and being made less free. And that's why the public really loved him, but the media hated him. And this really is a case of him having huge public support, but the media being really against him. And actually, perhaps, I don't know if you agree with this, perhaps that suggests quite a big disconnect between the media, the mainstream news, and the people themselves, especially considering how biased media is these days. I mean, the other thing he's criticized for, and if you really want to get an idea of Peterson's ideas and his amazing ability to speak and debate, you should watch the Cathy Newman interview. And Cathy Newman, she's a presenter of this Channel 4 TV show. She really attacks Peterson's ideas. She accuses him of being essentially someone who's propagating the patriarchy and someone who's saying that men should have dominion over women. And as you watch the interview, you can see that she completely mischaracterizes his attitudes and thoughts. There seems to be an issue in modern day society. I'm not sure if you agree with this, but where if you have a slightly differing opinion to what's considered the academic mainstream, you'll be instantly labeled a fascist or a racist, and no one. And if your view is sort of not, if it doesn't subscribe to the mainstream, it's instantly rejected. No one considers the nuance of your speech anymore. So a simple example of this is that Peterson doesn't. There's a quite popular notion in British and American and Canadian universities that we live in a patriarchal society, as in we live in a society where men oppress women. And Peterson says that men don't oppress women, and in fact, women live in a society which is free and is freer than any society that has ever been. And when he says that, people accuse him again of being a bigot, of being a sexist. But then he backs up his point and uses just the statistics, and he points out that actually between the ages of 21 and 40, women are paid a higher salary than men, which might sound surprising to you. Then he also talks about the fact that you can't say that men oppress women without considering how men are oppressed themselves. Men have to go to war, men have to do the most dangerous jobs, men have a far higher suicide rate than women. And he essentially wants to change this what's basically a feminist narrative or a modern day feminist narrative. And he wants to suggest that actually men and women have it equally bad. And that for the vast majority of history, men and women have been helping each other. And they've been supporting each other. And he sort of feels like there's become a sort of disconnect between men and women. Another one of his ideas, another thing that he takes serious issue with, is modern day identity politics. And it's essentially this idea that if you're of a certain race, you're not allowed to have an opinion about something. And that essentially the most valuable aspect of a character, the most valuable aspect of someone's identity is their race. That's also something that's quite popular in universities. It's quite a mainstream idea. Now, Peterson completely disagrees with this. And this idea that the most important aspect of your identity, of your race, it's a form of collectivism. It views a person in terms of their group and not as an individual. Peterson says that actually it's not race that is the most important aspect of a person's identity. It's their character. It's their character and their personality. And Peterson often says that, Martin Luther King would be turning in his grave if he saw how much race had been weaponized in modern day politics. Again, I mean, some of these issues might be quite unrelatable because these are more specifically Western European and American issues. And I don't know how much this affects Georgia and how much this is the case in Georgia. But identity politics is currently a big thing in Western Europe and America. Okay. Now, to move on to the book itself, excuse me. 12 Rules for Life is essentially, it's dealing with all these issues, and it's dealing with the fact that we perhaps live in a time where we feel that we have less sense of meaning. And this is reflected by a lot of things. For example, the incredibly high suicide rate. We have the highest suicide rate in Western, in the West, in democratic societies, the highest in history, essentially. And people have this lack of meaning, or at least that's what he's saying, and that's what he's identifying. And essentially what he tries to do with this book is he tries to bring back old truths that may perhaps give you meaning in life and help you to find meaning in life. And he says one of the best things in your life to do to find meaning is to take on responsibility, to take on personal responsibility and face the necessary tasks at hand that you need to do, and to accept that life is tough. But once you've accepted that life is tough, you've got a better access to truth. So what he often describes is that when he tells people that life is suffering, he says that they often feel really relieved when he tells them that. Because usually people are told, no, life is about your rights, life is about equality, life is about happiness. He says, no, I mean, all of those things are part of life, but the fundamental aspect is suffering and survival. We're biological creatures. We face illnesses, we face depression, we face the death of a loved one. That's the deepest truth, according to him at least. And he believes the best thing to do in life is to figure out how to deal with this suffering. Okay, so for starters, one that he's got is stand up with your shoulders back. Very simple rule. And the idea behind this is he sort of bases it in animal evolution. And he specifically uses the example of lobsters and the hormone distribution in lobsters, and essentially how their posture is affected by their levels of dopamine and serotonin. That their serotonin levels regulate their posture and their sort of how should I say, their dominance. And he says that likewise for us in our life, if we want to feel a better sense of dominance, a better sense of self-confidence and highest levels of self-esteem, stand up with your shoulders straight, and it will sort of symbolically give you this sense of being stronger and being taller. And it also, it's also like a physical, like it's a display for other people as well when you do this. Because when you're standing up with your shoulders straight, you're incredibly exposed. Your entire torso is exposed. But when you show this to other people, it shows that you have a sense of fearlessness, and people will take you more seriously. At least this is what he says. And he believes it's important for people to take you seriously. Because if you slouch and you're more closed, it gives people the impression that you have low confidence and you're full of fear, and it might make people subconsciously have less respect for you perhaps. But anyway, he's paying attention to posture in his first rule, and I won't go into too much detail so I don't ruin this book. And then other rules he has are rules like, for example, treat yourself as if like someone you would take care of. Take care of yourself as if you were someone you would take care of. So quite often human beings, they do a better job at taking care of, let's say, their pets, their dogs, than they are taking care of themselves. So you might give, you might find a human being they consistently give their dog the medication the dog needs, they comb their hair, they give them wonderful food, but they don't take their own medication. They don't maintain their own sense of health and well-being. And it's quite interesting why that happens, and perhaps that's because, I don't know if you guys can relate to this, but no one is better aware of your faults than you are. And that's why you sort of you punish yourself. You punish yourself because you're aware of all the things that are bad about you, and this can often cause you to hate yourself. And Peterson says a good way to solve this is view yourself as if you're someone that is worth being taken care of. And then he gives justifications for how you convince yourself of doing this as well. But essentially, the fundamental purpose of this book is to give people meaning in their lives and to give them purpose. And so far, it's a very popular book, and lots of people say that a lot of people say that it changed their lives. I highly recommend reading it. Anyway, do you guys have any questions? Something you'd like me to clarify, something you didn't understand, perhaps? Anything at all before I discuss what we're going to be talking about on Monday? Any questions, anything you'd like to say? Anything at all? No? Okay. So on Monday, we will be talking, sorry, not on Monday, on Wednesday, we're going to be doing a webinar on how to write a story. So essentially, we're going to look at how to write a good character, look at examples of good characters, bad characters, why they have failed, and perhaps even think about how to plan a narrative and how to give your story a good narrative structure. Okay. Thank you for attending today. Thank you for your contributions, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a nice rest of your day, and I will say goodbye for now. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. My pleasure. Thank you.